everybody. This is Brian Crawford, Executive Vice President of Government Affairs for AHLA, and we're pleased to have you participate in our Hotel Lobby Live series. Today, we're going to cover the issue of legal guest workers, specifically diving into the issue of H-2B workers and J-1 workers. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Keith Pabian, who's the founding partner of Pabian Law Firm based out of Boston, Massachusetts. Keith is in these issues and has built an entire law around helping businesses in our industry. And this has only become more acute as our industry has faced workforce shortages coming on the heels of the pandemic. So H-2Bs, then I'm going to turn it over to Keith. He's going to walk through the intricacies of what it takes to apply for H-2B workers, for J-1 workers, some of the pitfalls that you should avoid. And then at the very end, we'll take some questions. If you have questions, what I want you to do is enter them into the QA chat down below. And then at the very end, Keith and I will go through the questions and try to answer them as best we can. This webinar will be recorded and will be available for you after the fact to be shared with your colleagues and other AHLA members. So just in terms of H-2Bs, I think it's important to note that for most of our members, they see H-2Bs as a necessary evil. This is a big complex program. It is costly and is time consuming. And of the page, which is impossible to read, outlines by the Cato Institute the 175 steps that you potentially have to take to get an H-2B worker to come to the United States. It starts with getting prevailing wage determination. You need to get a job order. You need to work through multiple different agencies. You have to get a labor certification from the Department of Labor. You then have to prove that you have tried to recruit U.S. workers here domestically. And then finally, you can make a petition for a non-immigration worker. You then have to try to recruit an H-2B worker. So this is not for the faint of heart. This is not a quick and easy process, and it is incredibly challenging. But Keith is going to help us walk through the process and really provide you guys with an overview to become an H-2B employer. If we go to the next slide, part of the challenge that we're facing is, as many of you know, the H-2B program has an arbitrary cap that was set up by Congress where they provide for 33,000 visas for the first half of the year and 33,000 visas for the second half of the year, or the second half cap. Now, for the first time ever, DOL and DHS determined that based upon the first half cap of 33,000 visas, which was met incredibly early, that they were going to add an additional 20,000 visas. Those visas are for those workers that are in country for the winter months. So that's helping our friends that are in the ski resort segment and others during the winter period months. Now, for the second half cap, which begins for workers that start on April 1st, that cap has already been met again. So the 33,000 visas that are available for the second half of the year are already spoken for. In fact, there were 136,000 labor certifications issued by the Department of Labor. Basically, Department of Labor said that there was need for 136,000 people in the United States. There's only 33,000 visas available. So there's an incredible amount of demand and not enough visas. So we are working with the administration, trying to make sure that they issue as many additional supplemental visas as possible. If we go to the next slide. So I just touched upon the second half cap. Here are the numbers in front of you. So there was 7,800 different applications, which would cover 136,000 positions and only 33,000 available. So what did AHLA do? We're obviously pushing hard for HR 3897, which is the H-2B Returning Worker Exemption Act. It is bipartisan legislation introduced in the House, which would allow workers that have come to the United States under the H-2B program and won over the last 3 years to not count against the cap. That would provide huge amount of cap relief. Now, the returning worker exemption was law previously. It's actually been in law 2 separate times in the last 10 years. So we know that it works, and Congress seemingly knows how to implement it. It's the simplest fix for us to get some additional relief, and that is what we're currently advocating for. If we go to the next slide, please. So we're building momentum on the issue of H-2Bs. On the left of your screen, you'll see 2 senators, Senators King and Rounds, bipartisan senators, who sent a letter to the secretaries of DHS and Department of Labor urging them to release as many visas as possible under the law. What was notable about this letter was that they had bipartisan support from 34 United States senators. Let me tell you, as somebody who lobbies here in Washington, D.C., you can't get 34 senators to agree that the sky is blue, let alone sign on to a letter supporting H-2B. So that was pretty remarkable. On the right side of the screen, Congresswoman Salazar of Florida introduced legislation in the House that would reform the immigration system, would deal not only with DACA recipients and those people who are here undocumented, but more importantly, also included H-2B reforms. And finally, the Wall Street Journal just recently issued an article and an op-ed which eviscerated the argument that H-2B workers take away jobs from Americans. Undoubtedly, that has been one of the opponents of the program's strongest arguments, that H-2B workers are taking away jobs from Americans. Well, lo and behold, the data does not show that. In fact, H-2B jobs help support and increase the number of American jobs available. So we're seeing a lot of momentum to reform the H-2B program and hopefully provide some relief. If we go to the next slide, please. Finally, the last update I have is that Congress just passed their omnibus appropriations bill last week, and included in that bill was this language that allows for the Department of Labor and Department of Homeland Security once again to increase the number of H-2B visas in a fiscal year. Now, our goal had been to actually insert either more substantive language or potentially a returning worker language in the omnibus appropriations bill, but that was stripped out. But this language, at the very least, provides for DOL and DHS to have the ability to increase the number of visas under the law. It is unfortunate that we weren't able to get a hard and fast number included in the omnibus bill, but this provides us some hope that we're going to get some relief in the coming year as we're fighting for more H-2Bs. So with that as the backdrop in terms of what's happening here in Washington, I'm now going to turn it over to Keith. If we go to the next slide, I already mentioned that Keith is the founding partner of Pabian Law, which is based in Boston, Massachusetts. He's an experienced immigration lawyer who represents businesses of all shapes and sizes and helps them procure temporary visas, work authorization, lawful permanent residency, citizenship, and other immigration benefits in the United States. He's known nationally for his specialization in representing seasonal business, including many hotel members across the country in securing H-2B and J-1 visas. He focuses his work on guiding seasonal businesses in all immigration aspects, from defining the period of seasonality through the consulate and embassy process. So we're really happy to have you here, Keith. I know our members are looking forward to hearing from you. And again, if you have a question as Keith goes through his presentation, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom, and we will answer them towards the end of the webinar. Keith, over to you.
All right. Thanks, Brian. Thanks so much for having me. This is a huge honor to be able to speak to your membership. The other thing that Brian didn't mention is I'm also the co-owner of a company called Seasonal Connect, which is a staffing and operations solution for the lodging industry and other hospitality organizations. So I'm going to talk about that at the end, as well as a real solution. So Brian gave an amazing update there, Brian. You did a great job. And a lot of that backdrop is that there's so many Americans left the workforce, especially in the hospitality industry, that more and more organizations are turning to H-2Bs. So what I'm going to do now is I want to start with some basics, make sure we don't lose anyone along the way. And then from there, we'll go and go into some of the more advanced issues and really talk through, does it make sense for your organization, if you're not utilizing H-2Bs now, to look at them? So starting with the basics, I always start here because I think it's a really important thing to understand. The U.S. immigration system is really designed for technology companies, universities, higher ed. It's not designed for hospitality. And so as a result of that, and as a result of what feels like over the last decade, essentially, a lot of hurdles being put in place to prevent some of those industries that the immigration system wasn't created for, from pursuing certain visa options, we're not left with a ton for hospitality. So we have the H-2B and the J-1, which I'm going to talk about. Outside of that, there are some year-round options, but they're few and far between and harder to qualify for. It's got to the point that when clients reach out to us, and as Brian said, we're really a hospitality immigration firm. When they reach out to us about year-round options, the first thing that we talk about is green cards and permanent residency, because the year-round options have gotten so difficult. Even when you pursue those, though, what you're left with is the H-2B to keep people here while you're going through that process. So my big point here is, as we're talking through the pros and cons and a lot of the difficulties in procuring H-2Bs, just keep in mind that it still is hospitality's best avenue. So let's go to the next slide, and let's talk about what is an H-2B. Okay, so an H-2B visa can be applied for up to 10 months. So it's completely premised on your organization being seasonal. So I will tell you, most lodging organizations that reach out to us are seasonal in some way. How seasonal they are, it depends. And I think one of the big things out of COVID is that so many of you're seeing your seasons just get longer. But at the end of the day, we do need to show some level of seasonality. Now, the 10 months can be split into two. So some of our organizations, some of our clients, especially in ski country, might do a dual season where it kind of looks like two mountains. I can use my piece of paper. So, the government wants to see this, right? Like some level of a circle, but it can be two mountains, right? It can be two mountains there. But as long as we show that your expenses, revenue, and expenses go up during your busy times, and they go down when they're not, you can apply. And we see clients that go from 6 months up to 8 months to 10 months. It's really whatever you need. We apply every year. And I've been saying to clients, I think this is actually a positive right now. Because we apply every year, we can tweak things year to year. You can tweak your start and end dates. You can tweak what positions you apply for. You can also tweak how many people you apply for them. And that's been really helpful because more and more organizations are adding H-2B numbers and adding H-2B positions. You're going to hear me talk a lot about H-2B positions during this because the way that the H-2B process works, it's completely based on the positions. So when we start the application process, it's by what roles you need, not based on what people you need. And part of that is that we have to start so early. At the end of the process, you can either hypothetically, and we'll talk about this, bring people from outside the country to work for you, or transfer them from another organization in the United States. Especially in the lodging industry, we see a lot of our clients and a lot of organizations overall move people maybe from like Cape Cod or Mackinac Island or somewhere in the summer to a winter season organization that might be in Florida, in Southern Arizona, or in ski country. You do get to set the requirements of the position. So you could say that at your property, you require your housekeepers to have 3 months of experience. So there's actually a decent amount of flexibility in here from a hypothetical standpoint. And we're going to talk about some practical stuff as we go. So now let's talk about J-1 visas on the next slide. Now, I just want to briefly touch on these. We're going to primarily talk about H-2Bs today, but I want to also explain these because this is not an either or scenario. This is a lot of our clients do both. And what's different is the H-2B visa is the workhorse visa. This is designed for people to come here, work their butts off, and go home as the H-2B. The J-1 is different. The J-1 is designed as a cultural exchange visa. It's designed for recent graduates of university programs abroad to come to the United States to not only learn our culture, but also to practice what they've learned in school. There's two types of J-1s that we see in hospitality. One is the work and travel component, which is a 4-month visa. We usually see this in the summer. And then there's also the intern visa that can be 12 to 18 months in duration. Here's the pro and cons on both, though. So the work and travel can be great if you need bodies. They're pretty low level usually, but they serve a place. But these are people that kind of supplement, or at this point kind of replace what used to be the college kids who would come home for summer break and work during the summer. The problem for them is that they can't stay for the beginning and end of the season. So you lose those shoulder seasons when you still need to service your guests. The intern component is that longer term one, but I look at this as a management training program because you do need to shift them into different departments or different areas every 3 months. And so to me, it's not a great staffing solution, but it's a great management training program. What's nice about J1s though, is that it's basically a cost neutral visa opportunity for your property. And the reason why is the workers generally pay their way, not the organization. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the pros and cons. So for H-2Bs, you get professional workers. These are workers that want to work hard. A lot of them have hospitality experience from the past. They're usually some of your best. I hear from our clients that they bring up the work performance of the entire organization when you bring them. There's a reason why H-2Bs are so popular, despite what Brian was saying about some of the hardships of getting them here, and what we're going to talk more about that. You can bring them back year after year, but there is a lot of supply and demand issues right now, and there's also a lot of compliance obligations. There's also a financial component because you do have to pay not only for the visa petitions, but also for the travel to get them here. On the J1 side, you lose a lot of the experience and the ability to bring them back for subsequent seasons, but it's a cost neutral opportunity. I feel like it's almost like visa light if you're nervous about dipping your toes into the international waters. Like I said, though, there's a place for both of these programs. A lot of our clients utilize both. All right, so with that, let's talk more about the H-2B visa process. And so Allison, if you could skip ahead. So let's talk about the process. So the next slide, this might be one of the most important things that I say during this webinar if you're interested in doing H-2Bs. One of the biggest secrets to having a successful program is starting on time and meeting deadlines. So if you are a summer season property, now keep in mind your end date here is completely irrelevant. All I'm talking about is the date that you need your H-2B workers to kick off your busy season. If that is in April, May, or June, we start work on those at our office September 15th. If your season is more winter oriented, where you start October, November, December, we start those April 1st. Meet those deadlines. Regardless of whether you work with my firm or not, these are important deadlines to start. There's a lot of steps along the process that you cannot catch up on. And Brian showed you, I think, the worst case scenario of that puzzle game of going through the process. But what I will tell you is there's a couple of things in there that you need in order to proceed, and you can't catch up at a certain point. So these dates are incredibly important to meet. Now, let's talk about the popular positions. Let's actually talk about how you can use these successfully. So if you go to the next slide, you can see these are the popular positions that we're seeing in the hospitality industry. I also included some that we see at ski mountains because when we start talking about transferring workers to you, especially if you're a summer season organization, just have these in the back of your mind. So we see a ton of cooks and dishwashers in the back of house, ton of servers and busser runners and hosts front of house. Housekeeping has always been one of the most popular positions. Front desk has gotten more and more popular over the last 2-3 years. Groundskeepers, whether or not you have a golf course, just people to maintain the grounds. Maintenance and engineering is one of the more popular, newer ones over the last couple of years. Retail and cashiers. And then a lot of the ski mountains do lift operators, snowmakers, and ski instructors. All right, again, we'll talk a lot about moving people to you. So just keep those in the back of your mind as potential opportunities for you summer organizations. All right, in terms of where the workers are coming from, I listed the countries on the next slide. What you're going to see is every fall, no, I'm sorry, every winter, the government updates Homeland Security has to designate which countries are eligible. There's over 150 countries eligible. I would say the vast majority of our clients are heavy in Jamaica and Mexico. That being said, Eastern Europe and South Africa is popular. The Philippines came back a couple of years ago and remains very popular, especially for culinary. The UK, Ireland, Brazil, Central and South America is getting more and more popular as well. Just keep in mind, if they're coming in, you do have to worry about COVID issues. So just saying that out loud. All right, the next slide. One of the things that I think is starting, I think this perception is starting to fade. When I first got involved with H-2B visas a decade ago, a lot of organizations thought that H-2B visas were only for the largest properties, the largest hotels, the largest ski areas, the largest country clubs, and so on. That's not the case, especially in this job market. Organizations of any kind can utilize H-2Bs. It's really up to you if you think that it warrants bringing in international staff to fill your roles. We have some clients that see kind of like three key roles, like three people as warranting an H-2B visa petition, because those three people make or break their staffing. So this can be for any size. You don't have to be huge to make this work. All right. One of the other questions, which is on the next slide, is whether or not you have to provide housing and daily transportation. With the housing and daily transportation, you don't have to provide it. Okay, so you do have to get people to you for the start of the season. So, as Brian said, I live in Massachusetts. Let's say I own a hotel on Cape Cod. I would have to get people to Cape Cod for the start of the season. I would only have to get them home if they work the whole season, or I fire them and they're going back to their home country. So if they go down to Florida for the winter, I don't have to fly them home. What I'm talking about here, though, is housing during the season and the daily transportation to get them from their housing to the work site each day. You are not required to do it. However, we're going to talk a lot in the next few slides here about how hard recruiting is for H-2Bs. If you don't have answers of where people are going to live and how they're going to get to work, it's going to make it very difficult for you to recruit. So you don't need to go out and buy staff housing, but you do need to be able to point people in the right direction. And right now, what I'm seeing with our clients is staffing is problems 1 through 10, but the next thing down is housing, because just like there's a staffing crisis, there's certainly a housing crisis as well right now. And it is very expensive to live in a lot of seasonal areas and just in general anywhere right now. But you do not need to have staff housing. I would say maybe only a quarter of our clients, if that, actually own their own housing. But I'd say most of them do facilitate some level of housing. And at this point, a lot of them even subsidize the cost to some extent. All right. So if we paused here for a moment and we didn't talk about the next few slides and all the stuff that Brian was alluding to earlier, I would actually say H-2Bs are amazing. They're an amazing resource. You get really good workers, but this is the problem, is that because of the staffing shortage of Americans in hospitality, as well as basically every industry that utilizes H-2Bs beyond hospitality, the supply and demand issue is out of control. So let's go into the next slide. So Brian talked about this. I just want to give a little bit of some specifics here. So this H-2B cap is absurd. It was created in the 90s when Congress created H-2Bs, and it doesn't have any tie into the economy, unemployment rates, whether or not you can find US workers, and so on. It's set at $33,000 for summer season, $33,000 for winter. So it starts with the government fiscal year on October 1st. From October 1st until from October 1st until March 31st, there's 33,000 visas available. And then from April 1st until September 30th, the other 33,000 are available. And this only, and this is incredibly important because it's going to tie into a lot of the stuff we talk about next. It only applies to people coming from outside the country. My Cape Cod hotel that I'm bringing workers from some Florida resort, I don't have to worry about the cap because those workers are in country. That being said, let's look at some of the statistics. All right, so here's what's happening on the ground. So Allison, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So for summer season, it was awful this year. Okay. It's more competitive than ever. Again, for the summer season, the cap replenishes April 1st. The statistics you see here are only for what was filed for April 1st start dates. There are so many organizations beyond this that have April 15th, May 1st, May 15th, even June 1st start dates. This only applies to April 1st start dates. That shows how much demand there is for H-2Bs. All right, so this year they got about 136,500 worker applications for a 33,000 cap. What's terrifying, and this is why this is a big deal right now, beyond just the fact that they're over 33,000, they got about 40,000 more applications this year than they did last. So about 40,000 more applications for a 33,000 cap. The difference between the number of workers in 2021 and 2022 is more than the entire cap, just the additional workers. That's absurd. It's a random lottery. It's truly random. It is one of the most frustrating things for organizations that are summer season trying to bring workers in. All right, let's go to the next slide because this is no longer just a summer season issue. All right, so the winter season 2 years ago, I never had to talk about this because our practice is so hospitality driven. We don't have clients that fall outside of like after January 1st in terms of start dates. This is suddenly an issue. And this was a huge issue for organizations that had later winter season start dates, some of the hotels in Florida and Arizona, as well as the entire ski industry. So for the winter season cap that starts October 1st, they don't hit the cap the first day like summer season does. But in some ways, that's a little bit worse because we don't really know when it's going to be hit. And we can't, and for last year, a lot of the organizations got caught flat-footed. So for last year, organizations that essentially had a December 1st start date and later missed the numerical cap. The cap was hit right around there. That was 6 weeks earlier than ever before. And immigration was getting about 4 times as many applications per week than ever before. The question is, as we're heading into next season and we're starting work on those in 2 weeks on April 1st, the question is, when is the cap going to be reached? Because if they go at the same pace, right? If the cap gets hit 6 weeks earlier again, we're looking at October 15th start dates. And one of the things that's really frustrating as an immigration lawyer and as an extension for the entire industry is the immigration agency is very closed and not very transparent. And so in terms of updating the public on when the cap is being reached and the actual numbers to date, they're very slow to release those numbers, especially last year. And so what ends up happening is by the time you realize that there's a problem, it's way too late to change dates, to try to move things up and so on. So this is now a dual season issue. I think Brian would agree with this, that this actually helps the lobbying efforts because now year round, this is a massive problem. And I think it's also a huge issue because it disproportionately affects certain companies and certain industries. But this is a huge issue now for both seasons. All right. Now, here's the good news. You can potentially work around this. So let's go to the next slide and start talking about some solutions here. So in country transfers, I mentioned this before. If you're bringing the workers from outside the country, they count against the cap. All right. If you're moving people, though, from season to season, if someone is already in the United States on an H-2B visa and you're moving them to the next season, they do not count against the cap. Now, 2 things primarily here to understand. Number one is just because someone's in the country with an H-2B doesn't mean you get to skip the entire process. You still have to get permission from the federal government to employ foreign nationals. So you still need to start about 6 months before your start date to get that authorization, even if ultimately you find that worker here. The second thing is workers can only stay for 3 years consecutively, bouncing back and forth between seasons. After 3 years, they have to go home for at least 3 months, and that resets their 3-year allowance. So 3 years here, 3 months home. 3 years in the United States, 3 years home. So those are the 2 big things to understand big picture on in-country transfers. In terms of other issues, let's go to the next slide, please. These are kind of the four biggest issues that I see with in-country transfers. Number one is it's a very competitive recruiting market. It is no longer a secret that finding in-country workers gets you out of the cap. Okay, so if finding the workers is hard, we're going to talk about a solution in a few slides, but finding them is a big deal. The second thing is a 3-year limit. When you find them, you want to make sure that they can stay for your entire season and that they still have time left in their 3-year period. All right. The third thing down, the issue in yellow is a new issue. And this is where immigration, the laws don't change that much, but the interpretations do. And so this is a newer issue where the government used to be pretty okay with allowing gaps between seasons. So let's say that I'm a worker and I'm trying to go work for Brian. Okay, Brian's season starts April 1st, but my visa period ends March 15th. All right, so there's a 2-week gap between when I end and when Brian's season starts. In that situation, up until last year, they would approve it every time, as long as Brian filed my transfer application before March 15th, when my status expired. Last year or last fall, they started flagging this, and we saw this across the board. And I will tell you, it's inconsistent. So it's not fully there yet. But what's clear to me is they're retraining their officers. And what's happening now is with that 2-week gap, they're not approving it anymore. And so what we're recommending to our clients is to avoid gaps. And so if Brian has an April 1st start date, he wants to make sure that I at least have my visa status through March 31st. And then it at least goes right up against his. Now, so that's an issue of approval. If it doesn't, what we're seeing is that those people have to be pulled off the applications. Now, let's say Brian's application, though, starts April 1st at his company. And my end date, I'm a worker, and my end date goes through May 1st. This is another issue. In that scenario, Brian's application is going to be approved for me, right? I'm going to be approved to go work for Brian. But if he wants me April 1st, but my visa status goes through May 1st, there's a month overlap where Brian's going to be arguing with my organization for the other season of where I'm working, because I can only work in one spot at once from a practical standpoint. So just understand the overlap is another big issue where you want to try to find the right workers that bookend your season as much as possible with minimal overlaps and no gaps. So those are the biggest issues. I know those don't sound like a ton of issues, but finding the right worker and finding the right partner is a big deal. And partner is when I say partner, one of the big themes right now, or one of the big ways to get around this, is a lot of organizations are actually essentially partnering with one another, where Brian will go talk to another hotel or hospitality organization with the opposite season and try to say, hey, let's give opportunities to each other's workers to bounce back and forth. And what's nice about that is then Brian's finding multiple people instead of one here and there. All right, so that's the way around the cap issue. But just remember that it is a very competitive recruiting market. So Allison, let's go to the next slide and talk about just kind of where things are right now. So just from what's happening. All right, so J1s first on the next slide. J1s have really started to recover. They got decimated by COVID. When COVID hit, the State Department, which administers J1s, really pulled everyone out of the United States because they said, look, right, these aren't workers. They're really these cultural exchange students. We don't want to have them here in the midst of a global pandemic. That really decimated the program. There's also been a lot of consulate and embassy delays for every visa type for the last couple of years. Those are starting to ease up. And the J1 program, I think, is in the best shape that it's been in about 2.5 years now. So it's worth looking at, is what I'm saying. On the next slide, let's talk about H-2Bs. With H-2Bs, the demand is the issue. Overall, things are going really, really well. From our standpoint, like at our office, we feel like there haven't been a ton of changes over the last couple of years, or the last year probably. Things have really settled down. We know what the government's looking for. It's a demand issue. If we can, when our clients find workers or they do well with the cap, they're so happy. And the process is pretty seamless. The issue is demand. I will say though, just for those of you that did file for the summer season, you are seeing an issue right now where the Department of Labor, ironically, is short-staffed itself, and they're very, very slow. They're still working through the April 1st allotment, which means that there will be organizations that don't have that aren't able to meet their start date this year, which is absurd, but it is what it is. So let's go to the next slide. And so basically, like looking at the year to come, it's not going to be easy. The cap is going to be an issue for both seasons, winter and summer. The in-country recruiting market is going to be very competitive, and you need to position yourself in a way that's going to allow you to really recruit workers as well as make sure they don't drop off, right? A lot of you have seen this where the workers are playing offers off of one another to just keep driving up wages because they know that they're in demand right now. And I know we're all sick of talking about COVID, but just remember, as we start the process 6 months ahead for H-2Bs, which means we have no idea what's going to happen 6 months from now. I think we can all agree that we have learned we cannot control the future at this point. But with COVID, just remember, if you're doing in-country transfers, you don't have to worry about a new strain of COVID popping up in a country or like a consulate literally getting COVID and ceasing regular visa appointments. Because if someone's out of the country, they have to go to a consulate, or at least they have to rely on the consulate to issue them a visa. So in-country transfers have been helpful during the pandemic. All right. I thought this might be helpful on the next slide to show you some common mistakes that we see clients make. So Allison, I'm sorry, could you just go to the next slide, please? So, okay, biggest issue we see is not planning ahead. I cannot tell you the amount of times that clients are not ready, that organizations don't plan, that they reach out to you late, especially winter season. If you are a winter season organization, a lot of you have come to rely on a very standard visa process that you see as more administrative than anything else. That's no longer the case. And so you need to plan ahead as much as you can. You also need to talk to your visa, whoever files your visa petitions, and hopefully you're using a lawyer for that. But you need to make sure that you're running any changes in employment by them, because rent deductions, moving people to different roles, promotions, salary adjustments, things like that can get you into a lot of trouble, even if you're trying to benefit the H-2Bs. Allison, we lost the slide. I can't, there it is. Okay, thank you. It's funny, even when you try to help the workers, you can actually get yourself in trouble. So make sure that you're running any changes by your lawyer before making them, because you can get into a lot of trouble and spend a lot of money in fines if you're not careful. Not asking questions, like just make sure you know what's going on. The H-2B process is complex. There's a lot of components to it, and you need to make sure that you know what's going on. Missing deadlines is a killer. I referenced this before, but I'll get into a little bit of more specifics to just help you understand this. There is a step in the middle of the entire process where you have 14 calendar days to file an application. If you miss that step, you're dead in the water. And in order to file that application, you need to have another application back from the U.S. Department of Labor that's already issued. My point here is you need to meet the deadlines. There's a lot of traps there if you're not careful, and you need to make sure that you have the bandwidth to help the organization filing for you get this to where it needs to be. Now, communicating with department heads, and I think this is a big mistake just in general with staffing. So many of you are doing everything you can right now to make your property attractive to potential applicants, whether they're international or American. And flexibility is such a word that keeps coming up more and more. If your department heads aren't listening or don't know what's going on or are kind of going a different way, you're going to run into problems. Multiple points of contact, the passive recruiting, you need to be on top of things and just not communicating and setting expectations to your workers. So going to the next slide, the question really is it worth looking? Is it worth looking at international workers in this environment? And the answer, I think, is yes. I just think you need to have a plan and you need to know what you need to do. Because right now the Americans just aren't there, but international workers can be a really great resource. You just need to know where to find them. So with that, I want to talk about Seasonal Connect briefly. This is the other company that I own. We launched it in the midst of the worst staffing crisis ever by accident. We didn't roll it out at this time on purpose. But if Allison could hit play on this video, it's a 60-second video that's going to explain.
If you're a seasonal employer, you could feel all alone in the challenges you're facing. Overwhelmed by recruiting and unable to find workers. Buried in housing and transportation difficulties. And full of questions with no one to ask for answers. That's all about to change, thanks to Seasonal Connect. Seasonal Connect unites complementary businesses with the workers they need and the professional services that make everything run smoothly. You'll receive help finding in-country recruiting partners, seasonal workers, American and international, solutions for housing, daily transportation, and a smart community of other seasonal employers. Open doors to a new world of solutions for seasonal employers. Contact Seasonal Connect today.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Just a couple of quick things about this. Seasonal Connect is a completely different company than my law firm. All right. Seasonal Connect is designed for us to be able to really help everyone. And a lot of the members of Seasonal Connect are not members of the law firm. Different company, different staff. I'm essentially the only connection between the two. Let's go to the next one. I just want to quickly cover the features. It's the first time that you can use a search function to find employers for in-country recruiting partners. What we're seeing is you can use this search function to actually find organizations that want to help each other recruit American workers and H-2Bs. You can put in your dates. You can make sure that they go right up against each other and there's not too much overlap and that there's not any gaps. You can also use it to get so much information. What are organizations charging for housing? Do they have staff housing and so on? You can search for workers. You can literally click one button and all the in-country H-2B workers pop up. So, and it's interesting, if any of you are summer season and you didn't do well in the lottery, there's so many in-country workers still in this thing looking for work. You can post jobs and show what you're looking for. Do you look for in-country H-2Bs, out-of-country H-2Bs, American workers? Housing and daily transportation assistance, and then community activities. The community is just as important as the platform. We have in-person events and virtual events where we put employers in front of one another and in front of the workers. It's a really special thing. On the next slide, you can just see where we are today. We launched in July, but we are way ahead of where I thought we were going to be. We now have over 325 employers and over 6,000 workers. We're really committed to keeping that ratio going, and it's going really well. We actually just had our first in-person event, and it was really great. The employers were talking to one another and creating these recruiting partnerships to recruit both H-2Bs and Americans, because this is a resource for American workers as well, not just H-2Bs. Let's go to the next slide. So here's why this is important, and Allison, you can go right to the next slide from here. So right now, and it's gotten even worse since I put this on here, there's a 4.5 million gap. There are 11 million job postings, but only 6.5 million people looking for jobs. There's not enough Americans to fill them. And that's why H-2Bs are so prominent and why international staff is so helpful right now, but also why Seasonal Connect can help you find these workers that are actively working, that are American or H-2B. So on the next slide, we can skip 2 ahead. So you can sign up right online or get more information right online at seasonalconnect.com. And on the next slide, you can see all my contact information. And we definitely have time for questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Keith. Lots of great information there. And I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, those numbers are staggering. We're looking at 11 million job postings, only 6.5 million applicants, just a huge gap. And it's disproportionately affecting our industry. So that's why we're seeing an uptick in the number of H-2B applications. I expect that to get even worse. So we've got a bunch of questions here. I'm going to filter through them. And one of the things you didn't touch upon was the carve out that was included in the supplemental visas for the Northern Triangle countries, the 6,500 visas for Northern Triangle countries. Is there anything specific that members need to know about that, other than the fact that, at least from my perspective, what the Biden administration was trying to do and carve out those 6,500 visas for Northern Triangle was to address the issue on the southern border. But in terms of getting those workers in country and working, there's no difference at all, correct?
Correct. It was also a disaster. I don't think those countries were ready for this. And we had a lot of clients try it, and I don't think a single one found a worker from that area. A lot of the ministries were saying that a lot of the ministries from those governments were saying we have workers, and it just didn't come to fruition. Our clients felt like they were banging their head against the wall.
Yeah, we've heard similarly, but I do think there's an opportunity there, and we might need to try to work a little bit harder to make it work, because I'm hearing on the supplemental visas that we might be getting that there will once again be a set aside for the Northern Triangle countries. There was a question about, trying to recruit workers from Puerto Rico. Now, they wouldn't need to come under the H-2B program since they're American citizens, right? That is just more of a question of actual recruitment and then, travel costs and housing, correct?
That's exactly right.
So, that seems like that's a good opportunity for us to try to find Puerto Ricans who are looking to come and work here in the States.
Yeah, I've seen organizations do that. Look at that. Since the returning worker exemption expired, so what was that, like 6 years ago now?
Yeah.
I've seen clients try to look at Puerto Ricans, and I would say it's hit and miss. Like it has worked, but it's been few and far between. I think a lot of Puerto Ricans haven't wanted to leave the island, or haven't necessarily wanted to take seasonal jobs outside of like very Puerto Rican areas of the continental US, but it is worth looking at. I haven't seen it work a ton.
So there was a question, you touched upon the 10-month season, which is part of the H-2B regs, but then there was a question around how these workers could come to the United States for 3 years, go home for 3 months, and then come back again. Can you just walk through that process again around the 10-month season and how long they would be actually eligible to work here in the United States?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot because they're two different rules. Okay, so think of it as the employer rule and the worker rule. So on the employer side, you can apply for up to 10 months. Okay, so as an employer for your H-2B visa process, what I always ask organizations, like on the first call, if they're thinking about it, is what do you need, right? What is your actual need for your season? That can be up to 10 months. Now, the workers, though, they can stay for 3 years. Okay. When they stay, they have to make sure that they have a valid petition that they're tied to. So from that standpoint, the workers can stay for 3 years. They're bouncing around season-wise because there's no way to stay around an H-2B. I also saw a question, when they leave, they have to be out of the U.S. for at least 92 days. And the reason why is that it's really 90 days, but the travel days can't count. Okay, so they're out of the U.S. for 92 days. Then they have to prove that they're to the embassy when they go get their visa that they don't want to stay here permanently. But when they come back, they're eligible for another 3-year period. They could go work at an organization that has a 10-month need. Most of them wouldn't. They would want to work for something that's a little bit more seasonal, like a 6 to 8 month season. But there are two different issues. Organizations can apply for up to 10 months. Workers can stay for up to 3 years. Two different groups.
There was a question around lack of responsiveness out of DOL, in fact, in their application process, where they've been waiting on certification so that they can go and recruit out-of-country workers, and they're not getting any information out of the Department of Labor. Have you seen that elsewhere? And then is there any advice that you might give to try to break free of that lack of information?
Well, it depends on, so one of the things that we get this question a lot, you need to first understand where they are in processing. Because if they think that they're in their normal processing time frame, then they're not going to do anything for you if you reach out. You can email the U.S. Department of Labor, and depending on they always respond pretty quickly, but whether or not you get a response from the actual officer is a different story. Here's here's my take on the Department of Labor, though. I think it's actually pretty decently run overall. Like, I don't have a ton of complaints about them. I just think right now they're going really slow because they're understaffed. But you can email them if you feel like, you're waiting on I don't want to get too technical, but if you feel like you should have gotten your certification and you've gotten through that point and it's been multiple days, you can certainly email them. We have run into that issue, many times. But if you have a May 1st start date, the reason why you haven't heard from them yet is because they're still working on April 1st cases. It's not, and if you email them, it's going to do nothing because to them, they're still, there's no requirement that they act in a certain amount of time, which is frustrating.
It is frustrating. And they don't act in a certain amount of time to get supplemental visas ready for, the second half cap. So speaking of which, I have a question about the lottery. So for those of you who are not aware that when the cap is met and is oversubscribed, then they've implemented this lottery system. Can you talk a little bit about the lottery system and, how long does that process normally take? Candidly, I think the lottery system is absurd, but is there any way to improve your lot in the lottery, for lack of a better term?
So there's a lot there. Let's get through an easy thing first. So there's two agencies primarily involved in the application process for H-2Bs. One is the U.S. Department of Labor, and one is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, right? DOL essentially controls the entire application up until the very end. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which the acronym is USCIS, they are the only agency in the United States that can approve immigration benefits. So they come in at the end to approve. For winter season petitions, if you have an October, November, December start date, the lottery happens at USCIS. There's no Department of Labor lottery. And it's basically on the last day that they hit the cap, they do a random lottery. You don't get assigned any positions. You just know whether or not your application was accepted. And if it's accepted, you get a receipt notice, a fancy piece of paper. If it's not, you get the petition back with the money back from the government. All right, that's the winter cap. Summer cap is different. Summer cap, the cap gets hit the first day on April 1st. The lottery is done at the Department of Labor stage. All right. And so primarily done at the Department of Labor stage. And what they do is they do a random computerized lottery. They assign you groups A through however many they need. Group A is comprised of 33,000 numbers, which is the exact number of the cap. Each additional one is about 20,000 until they run out. So the last group is going to be under 20,000 because it's the last group. This year, they went all the way to group G, as in girl. Last year, I think they went to F or E. I can't remember now. And what they do is they go by group. So what ends up happening is, I almost picture it having each group has a pile of petitions. So there's group A, B, C, D. They start with A, they filter them out to the different officers. When those are all adjudicated, they move on to B, filter them out, and so on. From a practical standpoint, and I can only speak for our office, we see about half of our Group B petitions generally get accepted in under the cap because either Group A ones either get held up because of government requests. A lot of organizations are filing in-country transfers already, regardless of what grouping they're in, and they don't count against the cap or other reasons. You cannot improve your status in the lottery. I will tell you, based on our results, it is so clear to me it is really a random lottery. But because it's a random lottery, what ends up happening is some organizations get screwed and some are really happy. Some will end up with a disproportionate number of really good positions and some won't. But for the most part, you can see it's a real lottery. What hurts you is you can't improve your position, but if you don't do a good job on your petitions and you have typos or you don't do a good job of proving seasonality, the Department of Labor can ask you for additional evidence and they won't give you an approval, or they could deny it, but they also won't give you an approval until you respond. And that's what has made it so people miss the cap.
Yeah, it's a frustrating system, that's for sure. Speaking of frustrating, so I've got a question here about DOL and how they go about establishing the prevailing wage, and how would a potential H-2B employer go about finding out what the prevailing wage is for certain job categories?
So the wage is based either on the county or town, depending on state. I can put in the link. You can actually look online. This is one of the things in 2015, the U.S. The government updated the H-2B regulations in a positive way. I'm going to put this into the chat. This is the link to find the prevailing wage. The Department of Labor uses the mean wage. Okay, so it's actually really helpful. You can see there's going to be 4 tiers of wages, and then there's this mean wage. So you actually know going into the process what it will be. What the Department of Labor does is they issue it based on either the county or town, again, depending on your state, and then the job category. So, they have different buckets of jobs. So, for example, servers would go into the waiter and waitress category. Grounds workers would go into greenskeepers and landscapers. And so there are certain jobs where you have to try to figure out what bucket they fall in. I will tell you, for the most part, not always, but because of how competitive the wages have gotten in the hospitality industry, most of the time right now, I'm not seeing any issues meeting the prevailing wages. Just remember, though, the wages have to be paid to the U.S. workers as well. The U.S. workers and the H-2Bs all have to be paid minimally the prevailing wage.
Right. That's an important point. What about, there's a question, you might not have this, but what's the average cost all in of obtaining an H-2B worker? Do you have a sense of that? I mean, it depends on, there's a set fee in terms of what you owe the government, but travel cost, housing, that could be additional. And then obviously if you use a firm such as yours or another recruiting firm, there's additional fees, but I don't know if you have a sense of that.
I think our fees are pretty market. So I'm happy to tell you our fees. It's not a secret. So we by job categories. Remember, the job category is really what matters. So for a group, let's say of housekeepers, it's about $6,500. If they're in-country workers, you should add another $320 or $330 per person on top of that. But that $6,500 is our fees, government fees, and mailing fees. So it's about $6,500 and maybe another $320 per person, and then the travel costs and other costs as well. I would say, just to give you a ballpark, I would say it's probably about $6,500 for the job category, and then on top of that, $500 to $1,500 a worker, depending on where they come from and all of that. And then obviously, the more people you put on the petition, the more you're going to feel like you're going to be able to disperse that $6,500 among the group.
Yep. And just a little bit more, can you give a little bit more detail in terms of housing, transportation costs? I've certainly seen in certain markets, I think you mentioned it, whether it's Mackinac Island or other more remote locations where companies have decided to acquire housing for their employees because this is a critical need. But in other places, it's just your responsibility to help direct them in the right way. Talk a little bit about those logistics, if you would.
Yeah, so I feel like we could have a whole hour-long webinar just on housing, but it really depends on where you are. I will tell you, most of our winter season hotels do not have housing. They don't have employee housing. Some do, but most don't. Most of the winter season, the land is just too valuable, and they're better off either building guest amenities or more likely guest housing or other hotels on that land. Summer season depends, because some of them are so remote that they feel like they have to have housing. So our clients on the islands or in Mackinac will probably have their own housing, but others don't. That's not a reason to not do it. It just means that you might need to get creative. But what I'm seeing overall is the housing's getting further away from the work site, just because the housing crisis is so big. What I'm seeing now, like this is pretty new, like last 6 months, is a lot of our clients are starting to sign year-long leases rather than seasonal leases, and that's opening up housing that's a little bit closer. And I would say at this point, a lot of our clients are subsidizing probably about $500 to $700 a month is what they're asking the workers to pay, and they'll pay, the organizations will pay everything over that.
Well, Keith, thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise. We've hit our hour together, but I know that we could go on for hours, if not days, talking about the H-2B issue. I will say to our AHLA members out there, if you have not gone to hotelsact.org and filled out our action alert supporting the returning worker legislation, you need to do so today, because that is how we affect some change on Capitol Hill. That's how we produce and create, we produce more momentum and create more relief under the H-2B cap. So I urge you to go to hotelsact.org, fill that information out, reach out to your members of Congress, let them know about your acute worker shortage, and let them know that you need more help getting H-2B workers in the United States. Keith, thank you for your time, H-2B, your expertise on the H-2B issue, and thank you, HLA members, for participating in today's webinar.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Brian.